The plantation lay stretched beneath the Georgia sun like something resigned to its own cruelty. Rows of cotton moved gently in the breeze, white and deceptive, as if the land itself were innocent of what it demanded from those who worked it. From a distance, the big house appeared calm, dignified, almost graceful. Up close, it was a structure built on watching, windows positioned not for light, but for surveillance. Martha rose before the bell each morning. She always did. The air at that hour was cooler, thinner, offering a brief illusion of freedom before the day closed in. She washed her face with water drawn from the barrel, the cold shocking enough to remind her she was still present, still contained within her own body. Around her, other women stirred quietly, careful not to draw attention. Sound carried too easily on the plantation, and attention rarely brought anything good. By the time the bell rang, Martha was already moving toward the fields. She kept her eyes down, her posture unremarkable. Survival depended on not being noticed unless called. The overseer liked order, liked to believe that everything bent naturally toward his will. He rode the lines on horseback, a shadow that moved faster than fear itself. When he passed, conversation stopped, backs straightened, breath shortened. No one used his name aloud unless required. He was spoken of in fragments, gestures, silences. Everyone knew where he stood in the hierarchy, below the master, but above mercy. He enforced rules that were never written, punished infractions that shifted with his mood. He understood something essential about power, that it thrived when unpredictable. Martha had learned this early. She had learned it the way one learns heat from fire, not through instruction, but through proximity. Her body carried lessons no ledger recorded. She worked steadily, efficiently, never slow enough to invite correction, never fast enough to stand out. To an untrained eye, she was simply another woman in the field, indistinguishable from the rest. But the plantation watched her more closely than she knew. The overseer noticed patterns. He noticed who avoided his gaze, who stiffened when he drew near, who learned to disappear into routine. That kind of restraint interested him. It suggested something hidden, something unclaimed. And on a plantation built on possession, anything unclaimed was an invitation. Martha felt his presence before she ever saw him. The air shifted when he was near. Voices tightened. Even the insects seemed to quiet. She learned to measure distance by instinct, adjusting her movements just enough to stay out of reach. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The first time he spoke to her directly, it was about work. Her row wasn't straight enough. Her pace needed correcting. His voice was calm, almost conversational, which made it worse. Calm meant deliberation. Calm meant he had already decided something. She answered as she had been taught, eyes lowered, voice even. "Yes, sir." He lingered a moment longer than necessary, his gaze traveling where it had no right to go. Then he moved on, leaving behind the residue of his attention like a stain that would not wash out. From that day on, Martha marked time differently. She began to count not hours or days, but encounters. She noted where she was when he passed, who else was nearby, whether escape routes existed. The plantation had rules, but it also had blind spots. Martha learned both. Other women noticed the change in her. They did not ask questions. Questions were dangerous. Instead, they adjusted around her, creating space when they could, offering silent companionship when words would have been too loud. Shared glances carried entire conversations. "We see, we know, we cannot help." The overseer's behavior grew bolder. He summoned Martha to tasks that took her away from the group. Errands, cleaning, duties that placed her indoors or at the edges of the property. Each time, the imbalance of power pressed harder, like a hand closing slowly around a throat. He spoke to her as if she were something he owned twice over, not just by law, but by intention. His words were layered, offering nothing explicit yet implying everything. He enjoyed the ambiguity. It gave him room to deny and her nowhere to stand. The plantation itself seemed complicit. Walls absorbed sound, doors closed without witnesses. Even daylight felt unreliable in certain spaces, filtered through dust and age until everything looked slightly unreal. Martha learned which rooms to avoid, which paths to take even if they were longer. She learned that safety was never guaranteed, only delayed. One afternoon, the delay ended. The details would never be spoken aloud. They did not need to be. What mattered was the aftermath, the way Martha walked afterward, slower but steadier, as if something inside her had gone quiet. Not broken, quiet. Silence settled in her like a second spine, holding her upright when everything else threatened to collapse. The overseer behaved as if nothing had changed. That was part of the cruelty. Normalcy was his shield. He continued his rounds, his punishments, his smiles. But something in Martha's gaze shifted when she looked at the ground. It was no longer avoidance. It was calculation. Days passed. Then weeks. The plantation returned to its rhythms, reassured by the absence of disruption. The overseer grew careless. Power does. It convinces itself of permanence. Martha did not speak of what had happened. She did not cry in public. Grief, for her, was not loud. It was precise. It reorganized her thoughts, stripped them down to essentials. She slept less, ate less, observed more. She began to notice things she had overlooked before: the timing of patrols, the locations of tools, the way authority depended on spectacle. She understood now that fear worked best when it was seen. Remove the spectacle, and fear began to rot. This understanding did not come with rage. Rage was noisy, it drew attention. What grew inside her was colder, heavier. It did not demand release, it demanded resolve. The plantation sensed the change, though it could not name it. The overseer felt it first, an unease he dismissed as irritation. Martha no longer flinched when he spoke. She still obeyed, still lowered her eyes, but something essential had withdrawn beyond his reach. He did not like that. He increased his presence around her, his tone sharpening. He reminded her of consequences, of rules, of her place. Each reminder landed on something already hardened. He was speaking to a version of Martha that no longer existed. By the time the summer heat settled fully over the fields, something irreversible had taken shape. Not a plan, not yet. But a boundary had been crossed, and boundaries, once broken, could not be restored by force alone. The plantation continued its work, unaware that one of its quietest figures had begun to see it not as an unchangeable world, but as a structure, one that relied on belief as much as brutality. And belief, Martha understood now, could be shattered. As the sun set one evening, casting long shadows across the cotton rows, Martha paused and looked back toward the big house. The windows reflected the light, giving nothing away. Somewhere within those walls the overseer moved. Freely, convinced of his untouchable authority. Martha turned away and continued walking. The first session of her story does not end with action but with awareness. With the moment a woman long denied control over her own body begins to reclaim control over her own will. History often ignores such moments because they leave no visible mark, but they are the moments that change everything. The days that followed moved with an unnatural smoothness, as if the plantation itself were determined to pretend nothing had shifted. Bells rang, fields filled, orders were shouted and obeyed. From a distance the rhythm looked unchanged. Up close, something had gone missing, like a familiar sound no one realized they relied upon until it was gone. Martha felt the absence most sharply within herself. Fear, once a constant pressure shaping every decision, had retreated to a far corner of her mind. It had not vanished completely, but it no longer governed her. In its place was something quieter and more unsettling, a steady inward pull that refused to be ignored. She moved through her tasks with the same outward obedience, but her attention had turned inward, cataloging, measuring, learning. She began to see the plantation differently, not as a vast, immovable world, but as a system of habits. Men rode certain paths because they always had. Doors were left unlocked at specific hours because no one imagined they needed locking. Tools were stored where they were easy to reach, because convenience mattered more than caution. Authority, she realized, relied on repetition as much as force. The overseer noticed her change, though he could not identify it. She still worked as ordered. She still spoke only when spoken to, but the tension he had once enjoyed drawing from her was gone. When he raised his voice, it no longer produced the reaction he expected. When he stood too close, I dee not shrink. This unsettled him. He responded the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. He assigned her more tasks, longer hours, work that kept her isolated. He watched her more closely, trying to reclaim the power that had slipped through his fingers. The more he pressed, the clearer it became to Martha that his authority was brittle, dependent on her belief in it. Other enslaved people noticed as well. They saw how the overseer hovered, how his moods darkened when Martha was near. They sensed the danger gathering, like a storm that no one dared to name. Some avoided her now, not out of malice but fear. Trouble, on a plantation, was contagious. A few, however, drifted closer. An older woman lingered near Martha during water breaks, offering quiet presence. A man working the night stables adjusted his route so he could pass by her quarters, just close enough to be seen. No words were exchanged. Support did not require them. At night, when the plantation settled into uneasy stillness, Martha lay awake listening. She learned the sounds that belonged, and the ones that didn't. Footsteps had distinct rhythms. Horses shifted differently depending on who tended them. Even silence had patterns. She learned those too. The overseer's routines were the easiest to map. He believed himself unseen, above scrutiny. He drank at certain hours, grew careless in predictable ways. His confidence was his weakness. Martha understood now that power often mistook itself for permanence. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the air thickened with heat, the overseer called her aside again. His tone was sharper than before, edged with frustration. He accused her of working too slowly, of distracting others. None of it was true. Truth did not matter. She listened without expression, her hands folded, her posture respectful. Inside, she observed him the way one might observe an animal behind a fence. Dangerous, but limited by its own habits. He gestured too widely, stepped too close, misjudged the space between them. He did not notice that her gaze was no longer on the ground, but slightly past him, as if measuring distance. He dismissed her abruptly, unsettled by his own unease. As she walked away, he watched her back longer than necessary, sensing that something essential had slipped beyond his reach. That night, Martha sat outside her quarters long after others had gone inside. The sky was heavy with stars, indifferent to what unfolded beneath them. She turned a small object over in her hands, something ordinary, something that belonged to the work of the plantation. It was not a weapon. It did not need to be. It was simply a reminder that the tools meant to enforce labor could also be repurposed. She did not imagine herself as an avenger or a hero. Those were stories told by people who had the luxury of distance. What she felt was simpler and heavier. A line had been crossed, and the world had not ended. That knowledge changed everything. Days passed. The overseer grew more erratic. He punished others for small mistakes, trying to reassert control. He spoke often of discipline, of order, as if repetition might restore what he had lost. The plantation responded with obedience, but it was a thinner obedience now, stretched tight with awareness. Martha continued her work, her movements efficient, her expression unreadable. She spoke little, conserving her voice as if it were something valuable. She watched how the overseer moved through space, how he relied on the assumption that no one would ever challenge. Opportunity did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, on an evening like any other. The air was still, the work nearly done. The overseer lingered longer than usual near the edge of the fields, delayed by his restlessness. Few people were nearby. Fewer still were paying attention. Martha felt the moment before she understood it. A shift in the air, a pause in the usual rhythm. Her body responded before her mind fully caught up, muscles tightening, breath slowing. She did not think of consequences. Consequences had always existed, waiting patiently. She thought only of the present, of the space she occupied, of the fact that for once she was not being watched by anyone who mattered. She stepped forward, then stopped. Not yet. Timing mattered. She had learned that from watching him. Power failed when it was unprepared. The moment passed. The overseer moved on, unaware of how close the balance had come to tipping. Martha returned to her quarters that night with her heart steady, her resolve intact. The fact that she had stopped herself mattered. It meant she was choosing, not reacting. Sleep came easier than it had in weeks. The plantation sensed the tightening coil, though it could not articulate it. Animals grew skittish. Conversations faltered. Even the overseer seemed aware that something was approaching, though he mistook that awareness for irritation rather than warning. Martha spent her days refining her understanding. She did not rush. Rushing belonged to fear. What she was building required patience. She learned where sound traveled and where it died. She learned which people noticed and which looked away. She learned how quickly authority unraveled when stripped of spectacle. By the end of the season, the plantation stood as it always had, but it no longer felt immutable. To Martha, it looked fragile, a structure held together by habit and denial. She had seen behind the curtain now. She knew that the rules were enforced by people, and people could falter. Session 2 of her story ends not with violence, but with preparation. With the understanding that survival does not always mean endurance. Sometimes it means deciding that the cost of silence has become greater than the cost of action. And once that decision is made, the world cannot return to what it was before. The night did not announce itself as different. It arrived the way all nights did on the plantation. Slow and heavy, settling over the fields like a held breath. Crickets began their steady chorus, and the last traces of daylight slipped behind the trees. Lamps were lit one by one, their glow small and contained, revealing only what they needed to. Martha moved through her final tasks with practiced calm. Her hands did what they had always done, efficient and precise. No one watching her would have noticed anything unusual. That was the point. On plantations, survival depended on appearing unchanged even when everything inside had shifted. The overseer had been drinking again. His laughter carried farther than usual, loud and careless, a sound meant to remind everyone of his presence. He lingered near the storage sheds long after the others had moved on, his authority buoyed by the familiar confidence that night gave him. Darkness had always belonged to him. It hid his movements and excused his impulses. Martha noticed where he stood, how the lamplight caught his shadow and stretched it across the dirt. She noticed how few people remained nearby, how the sounds of work had faded into distant murmurs. The plantation was settling, folding inward, leaving pockets of isolation behind. She did not rush. She had learned that haste was the enemy of control. Instead, she let her steps align with the rhythm of the place, unremarkable and expected. When she passed him, she kept her eyes lowered, her posture obedient. He did not stop her. That, too, mattered. Moments later, he called her back. His voice was thick with authority, and something else he did not bow. There to hide. He spoke as if he were issuing an order, not a summons. She turned slowly, as though reluctant, as though afraid. He mistook her caution for weakness. They moved away from the main paths toward a space where the plantation's rules blurred at the edges. The air felt different there, heavier, as if even the land were holding its breath. Martha was aware of every sound, every shift in weight, every step that brought them farther from witnesses. Inside her, fear stirred but did not take control. It existed now as information, not command. Her body remained steady. Her mind remained clear. The overseer spoke, his words careless, layered with the assumption that power absolved him of consequence. He did not notice the way Martha's attention sharpened, the way her stillness deepened. He did not notice how completely she was present. What followed unfolded quickly, not with chaos but with terrible clarity. There were no dramatic declarations, no struggle that spilled outward into spectacle. The plantation did not hear it. The night absorbed the sound as it absorbed everything else. Martha acted with the precision of someone who understood that hesitation would undo her. The moment was contained, deliberate, and irrevocable. When it ended, the balance of the plantation had shifted, though no one yet knew it. The overseer did not die that night, but something essential was taken from him, something that could not be restored by authority or denial. His power, once absolute in its certainty, collapsed inward, leaving only confusion and pain. Martha stepped back, her breathing measured. She did not flee. Flight belonged to people who believed they still had somewhere safe to go. She understood now that safety had never existed here, only endurance. She waited. The first scream came later, tearing through the stillness like a crack in glass. Lights flared life across the plantation as people emerged from quarters, drawn by alarm and disbelief. Voices rose, overlapping, asking questions no one could answer. They found the overseer collapsed, his authority stripped from him as surely as his composure. Men shouted for help, for doctors, for anyone who could restore order, but order had already been broken in a way no medicine could mend. Martha stood a short distance away, visible, unmoving. She did not try to blend into the crowd. She did not run. Her calm unsettled those who noticed her, as if her stillness itself were an accusation. Someone pointed. Someone else shouted her name. Hands seized her arms, rough and urgent. She allowed herself to be taken, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the gathered faces. Fear rippled through the crowd. Not just fear of what she had done, but fear of what it meant. If one woman could do this, what else was possible? The overseer was carried away, his moans replaced by orders barked too loudly, too insistently. Authority tried to reassert itself through volume, through movement, through noise. But something had cracked, and everyone felt it. Martha was bound and held under guard as the night wore on. The air buzzed with rumor and speculation. Some whispered that she was mad. Others said she had been provoked beyond endurance. No one spoke loudly enough for her to hear clearly, but she felt the weight of their attention like heat on her skin. When dawn came, it revealed a plantation changed in ways that could not be undone. The overseer's quarters were closed off, his absence a wound no one knew how to dress. The master was sent for. Riders were dispatched. The machinery of punishment began to turn. Martha was kept apart, watched closely. She was offered water, then ignored. No one asked her why. Why was inconvenient? Why suggested causes rather than crimes? As the sun climbed, enslaved people moved through their tasks with a new awareness. Eyes met and held longer than before. Conversations paused, then resumed with subtle shifts. The plantation's hierarchy still stood, but it wavered, its certainty shaken. The overseer's power had not vanished with him. Systems like this did not collapse so easily. But the illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. That mattered more than anyone would admit. Martha sat alone for much of the day, her thoughts moving slowly, deliberately. She did not regret what she had done. Regret belonged to people who had choices. She understood the cost of her action and accepted it without illusion. What surprised her was not the fear she felt, but the clarity. She had acted not out of rage, but out of refusal. Refusal to accept that her body was not her own. Refusal to continue believing that endurance was the same as survival. In that refusal, she had claimed something the plantation had spent years trying to erase. By afternoon, officials arrived. They asked questions framed as accusations, their language heavy with assumption. Martha answered when required, her voice steady. She did not offer explanations. Explanations would only be used against her. The overseer's condition was discussed in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might spread the damage. His future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he would never again command the plantation the way he once had. Fear had turned inward, and everyone knew it. As Martha was led away under guard, she passed the fields she had worked for so long. Cotton moved gently in the breeze, unchanged, indifferent. The land did not judge her. It simply bore witness. Behind her, the plantation struggled to contain the meaning of what had happened. They would try to reduce it to an isolated incident, a singular act of madness. They would insist that order had been restored. But among those who had seen, who had felt the tremor ripple outward, the story had already begun to change shape. Martha was no longer just a woman who worked the fields. She had become proof that the system was not absolute, that its violence could be answered, even at unimaginable cost. Session 3 ends not with closure but with rupture, with the moment when silence is broken so completely that it cannot be repaired. What follows will not be justice, nor mercy, but something colder and more revealing, a reckoning not just for Martha, but for the world that made her choice inevitable. They moved her before sunrise, when the fields were still silvered with dew and the world looked briefly innocent. Chains were not used, rope was enough. The men escorting her spoke little, and when they did, their voices stayed low, as if raising them might invite something they could not control. Martha walked between them with her back straight and her gaze forward, neither defiant nor broken, but fixed on a point beyond the road ahead. News had already outrun them. By the time they reached the county seat, whispers clung to doorways and lingered in taverns. The story had begun to splinter, reshaped by fear and imagination. Some said she was a monster. Others said she had been driven mad. A few quieter voices suggested something else entirely, but those voices rarely traveled far. The jail was a narrow stone building that smelled of damp and resignation. Inside, the air was cold even in summer, and the walls seemed to absorb sound. Martha was placed in a small cell with a single window too high to see through. Light filtered in just enough to mark the passing of time. She sat on the bench and waited. The waiting was worse than the night on the plantation. There, Everything had been immediate, physical, contained. Here, time stretched and thinned, becoming something. She had to endure without movement. Guards came and went. Food was slid through the bars without comment. Once, a man stood outside her cell longer than necessary, staring at her as if trying to reconcile the person he saw with the act he imagined. She did not look back. When the questioning resumed, it took on a different tone. These men were not overseers or field hands. They were representatives of law, and they believed that distinction mattered. They spoke of order, of precedent, of the danger of allowing certain lines to be crossed. Their questions were framed carefully, designed not to understand but to contain. Why had she done it? Had she planned it? Had anyone helped her? Martha answered only what she had to. She did not volunteer details. She did not offer emotion. Emotion would be interpreted as guilt or madness, depending on which served them best. Silence, she had learned, could be shaped into something useful. Outside the jail, the overseer's fate was discussed in hushed tones. He had survived, but survival was not the same as recovery. His authority had collapsed the moment his body failed him. Plantation owners worried aloud about what this meant, not for him, but for them. If fear could be turned inward once, it could happen again. The trial was scheduled quickly. Speed was essential. The longer the story lingered, the more dangerous it became. On the morning it began, the courthouse filled with people who came not for justice, but reassurance. They wanted to see the world put back in its proper order. Martha was brought in under guard, her plain dress stark against the polished wood and fine coats. She took her place without hesitation, her posture composed. She did not search the room for familiar faces. There were none. Testimony unfolded like a script already written. Witnesses spoke of her quiet nature, her obedience, her lack of prior TR. These facts were presented not to humanize her, but to heighten the sense of betrayal. The overseer's position was described in careful language that avoided any mention of abuse. He was a man doing his duty, a man enforcing discipline, a man wronged. When Martha was given the chance to speak, the room leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Curiosity buzzed beneath the surface. Would she cry? Would she plead? She did neither. Her voice, when it came, was steady and measured. She did not deny what she had done. Denial would only prolong the spectacle. She did not explain it in terms they wanted to hear. She spoke simply of boundaries crossed and silence that had become unbearable. Her words were calm, but they landed like stones dropped into still water. The judge did not meet her eyes as he interrupted. Such explanations were unnecessary, he said. The law was clear, the courtroom relaxed, grateful for the return to familiar ground. Complexity had been banished. The verdict followed swiftly. It was delivered with solemnity, as if gravity itself might disguise its inevitability. Martha listened without reaction. The sentence was severe, designed to send a message far beyond her own fate. This was not about her alone. It was about restoring fear. As she was led away, the room exhaled. Order, it seemed, had been reasserted. But outside, beyond the courthouse walls, something else was happening. The story was already slipping from official hands. Among the enslaved, Martha's name began to circulate quietly, carried not as a warning, but as a point of reference. They spoke of her in fragments, careful not to attract attention. Each retelling stripped away a little more of the fear that had surrounded the act. She was no longer just a woman who had worked the fields. She had become evidence that the system, for all its violence, was not invincible. Martha's days were spent in confinement. She was moved again, this time farther from the plantation, farther from anyone who might remember her as she had been. The journey was long and silent. She watched the landscape change, fields giving way to forest, familiar ground replaced by something unknown. In her solitude, she did not dwell on what she had lost. Loss had been a constant companion long before the night that changed everything. Instead, she thought of the moment when fear had released its grip, when she had acted not because she believed she would survive, but because she refused to continue disappearing. That knowledge sustained her in ways nothing else could. Records would later reduce her to a few lines of ink. Name, crime, sentence, no mention of context, no acknowledgement of the forces that had shaped her choice. History, written by those invested in order, rarely pauses to examine its own foundations. But memory is not bound by records. Years later, long after the overseer's name had faded from conversation, Martha's story persisted in unexpected places. in the way women warned one another with a look rather than words, in the way men lowered their voices when speaking of authority, in the understanding, passed quietly from generation to generation, that silence could be broken even if the cost was unimaginable. The plantation continued. Others took the overseer's place. The machinery of control adapted as it always did. But something essential had been altered. The illusion of absolute power had been cracked, and cracks have a way of spreading. Martha herself vanished from public memory, absorbed into the vast anonymity forced upon people like her. But the idea she left behind could not be contained so easily. It lived on as a reminder that endurance has limits, and that sometimes history turns not on grand movements, but on a single moment when a person decides that survival requires more than obedience. In reflecting on Martha's story, we are asked to confront uncomfortable truths about power and silence. Her act cannot be understood without acknowledging the system that made it inevitable. It challenges us to consider whose voices are erased in the telling of history, and whose suffering is deemed irrelevant until it disrupts the order of those in control. Martha did not set out to become a symbol, but in crossing a line that was never meant to protect her, she exposed the violence embedded in the world around her. That exposure, more than the act itself, is what history tried so hard to bury. Thank you for staying with this story. This is Susa Buried Stories, where we uncover the truths hidden beneath silence, fear, and forgotten records. If this episode made you think, moved you, or challenged what you thought you knew, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who believe history deserves to be examined honestly. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read them, and they matter. Stay connected with us, and reach out if there are more untold stories you want brought to light. Some histories were buried for a reason, and together we can make sure they are not forgotten.